Hello everyone, it's so nice to be with you. And now we're going to do some work to learn the practice page 2 for level 1 of the Rhythm Rainbow. So we're just going to remember what our notes are. Do you remember what this one is? Do you remember how many beats this has? Yes, one beat, one beat, one beat, one beat. Fantastic. Do you remember what the full name of this note is? Good for you. Quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note. Do you remember the nickname? This is what we say when we see it on the page and when we see it so that we can play and say it. What is the nickname? Yes, ta, 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 ta. Fantastic. Now, what about this one? What are these notes called? The full name, the proper name of these notes. Do you remember? Eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes. And you see how different they are from the ta? They look the same except that they have this line across. This beam. We call this a beam. This is a beam that goes across, connecting the two notes. And when that beam is split, there's only one eighth note. You'll just see a little one flag. There'll be one flag on the side. But when they're together, there's a beam that goes across the two notes. And they are called, the full name are eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes, eighth notes. Fantastic. And do you remember how many beats these have? Now together they have one beat, but separated, each of them is a half a beat. So it's half a beat plus a half a beat equals one beat. Half a beat plus a half a beat equals one beat. That's how these work. And now the way we say this, do you remember how we say it when we're playing it and saying it? T-T, 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 T-T. Fantastic. So good for you. You remember all of those. When we play, you can use pens, two pens that you can hit together. You can use spoons. You could use two pencils. You could use a table in front of you and you could play ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. You could do it like that as well, as if you're playing a drum. You could use rhythm sticks or drumsticks, wooden sticks of some sort. I'm going to use these two kitchen roll tubes. So I'm going to use those again today. So let's go directly to me playing you some tas and titis and you responding, just for you to listen and say and play them back. So I play and say, and you play and say back, okay? I'm not going to do it with you this time. Let's see if you can do it. Ta, 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 ta. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ta. How did you do? It should be pretty good by now. Let's go now to page 2 of the Rhythm Rainbow practice page, level 1, page 2. So we're going to start with line A, and I am going to play each measure and then you repeat it. Now I'm going to do it with you when you repeat it. I'll do it quietly. So I'll play and say the first measure loudly, and then we'll repeat it, and I'll do it softly. And please read the music. It's important for you to read the music. So let's try it. A. Ta, 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 ta. ta, ti, ti, ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta. Fantastic. How did that go? Let's do that one more time. Ready? I play and say, then you do it. Ta, 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 ta. Ta, ti, ti, ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta. Ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta. Fantastic. Now let's do the whole line together. Okay, the whole line A together. We're going to do this twice, so you'll have two chances. So let's try it. A together. We'll do it once now with me. 1, 2, ready, play, and say ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, 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 ta. How did you do? Did you do well? Let's try it again, because you know, musicians need to practice. We need to practice, practice, practice. We need to repeat and practice. Practice, repeat, repeat, and repeat. That's how we learn. You just keep at it. Stick to it. It's a really important thing to do so that you can really get good at becoming a musician. Okay, A, line A. 1, 2, together, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, 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 ta. Fantastic. Let's go to B. Make sure you play and say. Make sure that you are reading the notes. So you're hearing, but you're also reading, because you need to be able to read these on your own. B, 1, 2, ready, go. Ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Do you think we could do that again? Just go through the whole thing. Let's do it 2 more times. Line B. Okay, 1, 2, the whole thing, go. Ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Good for you. Let's try going through the whole thing one more time. Together, 1, 2, read the notes. Ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. Fantastic. Now go to C. Can you read the first measure in C? Just take a moment. See if you can do it on your own. Okay, now I'm going to do it. Then I want you to repeat it after me. This is the first measure. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti. Is that what you had when you did it on your own? I bet you did. Let's do the second measure, okay? Take a moment to read it. Good. Now I'm going to do it and see if it's right. Ta, ti, 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 ti. Was that what you had? I bet it was. Now let's try the third measure. Read it on your own. Okay? Now I'm going to play and say it, and then you're going to do it after me, okay? Third measure. Ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta. Did you have that? Did you get it? Fourth measure. I do it first. And let's see how it goes. Ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti. How did that go? Let's try playing the whole line of C, okay? The whole line, C. 1, 2, ready, play. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti. How did that go? Did you do well? Let's try it one more time. That's a little tricky because there are lots of TTs, but all you do is read it. Just read it. You know tas and you know TTs. It should be very simple. You have to just keep that steady beat going. So, C together. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti. Good for you. That's great. Let's go to D. Look at the first measure. Say it on your own. Now I'm going to play and say it. See if it's the same thing, but you're going to repeat right after me, okay? First measure. Ta, ti, 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 ti. Good. Take a moment to play and say the second measure. Good. Now I'm going to do it. Ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Was that what you had when you did it alone? Now play and say the third measure. Good. I'm going to play and say it, and then you repeat after me. Let's see if it's the same as what you had when you did it on your own. Ti, 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 ta, ta. Good. Let's do the last measure together because that should be easy. Ready? 1, 2, together, go. Ta, 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 ta. Great. Let's try the whole line D. The whole line together. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ta. Good. Let's do it one more time. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ta. Okay, fantastic. That is really awesome. Now we're going to play A, then go to B, then C, then D. Okay? We're going to do it together, and I will call out when it's time to go to the next line. So if for some reason things have not worked out in line A, you can know when it's time to start line B and just get ready to come in with us in line B. Same thing for any other line, okay? You can do it. Here's line A. Let's start with A. 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, 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 ta. B, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. C, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti. D, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ta. How did you do? Let's try the whole thing one more time. Okay? Try it with me one more time. You're doing great. Good for you. A, 1, 2, ready, go. Ta, 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 ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, 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 ta. B, ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 ta, 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 ti, ti, ta. C, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti. D, ta, T, 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 ta, ta, T, T, ta, T, 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 ta, 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 ta. Fantastic. Isn't this fun? This is so good for your brain. This is so awesome. You are doing such a good job. Now, if you need to keep practicing, you can go back and do it again. Practice, 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 practice. We have to just keep practicing so that we get really good at it. Some people can get really good at it really fast, and other people just need a little more time. So if you need more time, that is fine and perfectly wonderful, because you're just going to keep getting better every time you do it. So do not worry. If you don't get it the first time or the second time, just go back and do it some more. And it will get better and better every time you do it. I promise. I promise. Keep at it. You are doing so well. Congratulations. Bye. Hi, everyone. My name's DIANA JACKLIN. I'm an opera singer, song recitalist, and voice teacher, but I'm also here to offer you some basic music education for your children or for yourselves. So if you like this channel, if you like these videos, if you want me to do more for you, please subscribe and please like and please share with your friends.